Our scripture for this evening is the Gospel of John, St. John chapter 12, verses 42 and 43. Again, the Gospel of John chapter 12, verses 42 and 43. Think back on your junior high or high school years. Many people felt a tremendous amount of pressure to be popular. And if they were not popular, many wanted to hang out with the popular kids or the cool crowd. As we go on in life, we continue to find that for some, this desire for acceptance and this desire to stand out remains an active part of people's personal pursuits. Some people want to be the favorite relative, the favorite niece or nephew, for example. You even hear that at funerals when people get up to talk about what is supposed to be the life of the deceased. And unfortunately, there are people that make it about themselves and not the deceased. They'll say something like, I was the favorite cousin, I was the favorite niece or nephew, which is perhaps an inappropriate consideration given the fact that a eulogy or a sermon or a time dedicated to a funeral is supposed to be about the deceased, not about the person affirming themselves. Then we live in a time where people wanting to be accepted say and do things that are politically correct. They don't want to go against the grain. They go along to get along. There is something innately a part of human nature where people struggle with their desire for reward, for recognition, and to be received by others. One of the things that we must recognize about being a child of God, however, is that we are not called to popularity, we're called to peculiarity. Because Christianity, by virtue of our mission, by virtue of our submission to God, is most unpopular in a world that is hell-bent on doing what it wants to do. Consider these words in John chapter 12, verses 42 and 43. There the Bible reads, Nevertheless, among the chief rulers also, many believed on him, but because of the Pharisees they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they love the praise of men more than the praise of God. Let's look at some things in these two verses to understand the difference between popularity and peculiarity. First, Christianity or relationship with God is politically incorrect. Jesus was not popular in the sense of how we understand popularity today. Of course, there were the crowds who followed him, but those crowds tend to have focused on a healing, a miracle, some wonder that he had done. But when it came to preaching and teaching truth, standing for what was right, and going against the government, challenging the status quo, Jesus was wholly unpopular. So we must understand that as Christians, it is not our job to be politically correct. There are people who will not even discuss Jesus with others because they believe it's not the politically correct thing to do. We are challenged to go against the grain. Second, we must be willing to experience persecution. Persecution may be as mild as simply being designated an unpopular person to something extreme like death, as had been seen by many in the first century and even in these times in which we live. In either case, we must recognize that as a child of God, as a person going against the grain, that we must be willing to endure for the cause of Christ. If you look carefully at John chapter 12 and you see that the people did not want to confess Jesus, the chief rulers, people who had something to lose in terms of their personal popularity, because they feared being put out of the synagogue. They feared what would happen to them and what they would lose. There's nothing that you can lose for the cause of Christ that God cannot restore many times over. Third, we must learn to prioritize eternal benefits over time benefits. Again, there was a benefit to these chief rulers in that they were popular, they were respected, they were socially accepted, and they forsook the potential of an eternal reward for the problematic temporary time reward. We must prioritize what we get from serving God over anything that we can get from being accepted by man. Number 4, and most interesting, is that we have to value a personal relationship with the Lord versus a place relationship. Let me say that again. We have to value a personal relationship versus simply having a place relationship. What I want you to notice in John chapter 12 and in verse 42 at the very end of the verse, the place the chief rulers feared being put out of was the synagogue. It was not the government building. It was not an arts or museum or theater or place of a worldly place, but it was a spiritual place, theoretically speaking. They feared being put out of the synagogue. Oftentimes in the Bible, we read about the tabernacle, we read about the temple, and we read about the synagogue. What's the difference? The tabernacle was a tent in the wilderness. It was a place in which God could dwell with his people during the Israelite journey to the Promised Land. The temple was a central place of worship established in Jerusalem. The synagogue, for all practical purposes, is what we might consider the local church. The synagogue was the place of prayer and instruction and a sense of community. And yet we see that there was spiritual corruption in the place, and they feared being put out of the place, the synagogue. And yet what we see here is a need to not focus on the place, but to focus on a personal relationship with the God of heaven. In other words, we cannot become so hung up in institutions that we miss relationships. And many people are institutionalized in their so-called Christian walk that they miss the relational aspect of walking with Jesus, which is not defined by a place, but an experience that you have each and every day. Remember that as children of God, we are not to focus on being popular. We are peculiar people who are politically incorrect, willing to accept persecution, prioritizing eternity over time, and valuing a personal relationship over a place relationship. This has been another installment of A Few Minutes with the Minister.